So please excuse me for my voice. I'm trying to recover and gain my voice back here. But good afternoon. I'm Ezekiel Dixon-Roman, and welcome to the Control Society Speaker Series. So welcome, and this is the 5th installment of the Control Society Speaker Series, which is sponsored by the School of Social Policy and Practice, the Price Factor Digital Humanities, and it's also supported by a grant from the Provost Office through the Diversity Fund grant. This afternoon, I have the esteemed and humble pleasure and opportunity to introduce to you all Mark Hansen. Mark Hansen is professor in the literature program and in computational media, arts, and cultures at Duke University. His work focuses on the experiential and non-representational effects of technologies. Hansen is author of Embodying Technesis, Technology Beyond Writing, New Philosophy for New Media, as well as Bodies in Code, as well as numerous essays on cultural theory, contemporary literature, and media. He has co-edited the Cambridge Companion to Merleau-Ponty and Emergence and Embodiment, new essays on second-order systems theory, and critical terms for media studies. His book, Feed Forward, The Future of 21st Century Media, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015. Professor Hansen's current projects include Designing Consciousness, which we're going to get a taste of today, Logics of Futurity, and Topology of Sensibility towards speculative phenomenology. His talk today is entitled The Designing Consciousness Between Algorithmic Identification and Material Synthesis. And without further ado,
thank you. Thanks. All right. Thank you, Ezekiel. I'm happy to be here. It's interesting to learn about the different things that are going on that have brought people here to this room. But doing this kind of work in a policy situation is sort of new to me. So I'm curious and also fascinated with that idea. I mean, I'm a theorist, and my paper ultimately is theoretical talk, but I'm trying to engage with some concrete issues about algorithms and the way that they operate in relation to identity. So, so at any rate, the question that I want to explore today, I want to just state it at the outset, is the following. What role does consciousness play in a world where technomaterial processes increasingly seem to operate in advance of and in ways that bypass conscious awareness altogether? Okay, and this is a problem that in ways I'm going to explain in a little bit, that I got to at the end of my book on Whitehead and media called Feed Forward, that was published in 2015. And my argument was that consciousness is no longer the master of its experience, but is a sort of supervisory element that in ways that I'll explain again, that accompanies experience without being present at it, right? And so my question is really, how do we describe the new function of consciousness in these networks where processes happen outside of the awareness of consciousness, outside of the awareness of humans? So I want to begin by just giving a kind of example of what I mean, and I'm going to really sort of cite somebody. So it's the work of I guess he's an art historian and critic, Benjamin Bratton, who's written a book called The Stack, in which he describes the global computational system in which humans are implicated. For Bratton, it's both the modularity of governance and sovereignty in the internet age, as well as the particular disenfranchisement to which this subjects the human element that's crucial in these networks, and I'm going to just cite from him. I propose the stack as a way that we might map political geography, but also for how we understand the technologies that are making that geography. Planetary scale computation takes different forms at different scales. Energy and mineral sourcing and grids, subterranean cloud infrastructure, urban software and public service privatization, massive universal addressing systems, interfaces drawn by the augmentation of the hand, of the eye, or dissolved into objects, users both over-outlined by self-quantification and also exploded by the arrival of legions of sensors, algorithms, and robots. Instead of seeing all of these as a hodgepodge of different species of computing spinning out on their own at different scales and tempos, we should see them as forming a coherent and interdependent whole. These technologies align layer by layer into something like a vast if also incomplete, pervasive, if also irregular, software and hardware stack. And the book is a 400-page massive tome describing the separate levels of the stack, which are all interpenetrated with one another and functioning together, and of which the human level or the user level is merely one level, right? So he continues, as the shape of political geography and the architecture of planetary scale computation as a whole, the stack is an accidental megastructure, one that we are building both deliberately and unwittingly, and is in turn building us in its own image. So Bratton is here describing the place of the human, which he reconceptualizes as the level of the user, as I just said, within the stack, as a design product of the operation of governance as computation, right? And he says, finally, the primary means and interests of the stack are not human discourse and human bodies, but rather the calculation of all the world's information and of the world itself as information. We, the humans, while included in this mix, are not necessarily its essential agents, and our well-being is not its primary goal. Okay, and I just present this by way of sort of trying to give you an idea of what it is I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think the way in which humans are imbricated, implicated in these kinds of complex systems where their own agency and their own modes of perception and cognition are not privileged or not in the position of mastery and knowledge of how the whole thing works, but they're rather components of this larger system, right? And so I'm trying to ask, what role does that thing that we've identified philosophically, but also extra philosophically as the privilege of human consciousness, what role does that play in this new kind of environment? Okay, so my paper is in, I think it's 7 sections, and I think it's about 35, 40 minutes. So the first section is called From Feed Forward to Designing Consciousness. So this question that I'm posing, what role does consciousness play in a world where techno-material processes increasingly seem to operate in advance of and in ways that bypass conscious awareness altogether? This question comes on the heels of my study of 21st century media in my book Feed Forward, where I sought to describe the becoming environmental of media, and I'm citing myself, encompassing everything from social media and data mining to passive sensing and environmental microsensors. 21st century media designate media following their shift from a past-directed recording platform to a data-driven anticipation of the future. With this term, 21st century media, expressly chosen to stand against the great technical media developments of the 19th and 20th centuries, namely phonography and cinematography, I sought to foreground the shift in address of media themselves. If media formerly operated to inscribe and store experience following protocols that largely coincided with the ratios of human sensory and perceptual experience, today's massive dissemination of computation into the world has had the effect of decoupling media operationality from human understanding. Now media typically couple with other media in operational resonances that have no role for, even as they create the infrastructural support of human experience. The task I set myself in Feed Forward centered around the apparent paradox created by this new mode of media operationality. If media have ever increasingly come to operate outside of the phenomenological registers germane to human experience, if media have indeed become environmental, can they still be said to impact our experience, and how? And that's been sort of the crucial question for all of the books that I've written since the first one, right? Sort of how do we use, what resources from philosophy and theory about human experience can we use to address challenges to that issue that are posed by media? To address this crucial question, one that implicates philosophical conceptualization as much as media history, in Feed Forward, I developed a non-prosthetic theory of media that situates media first and foremost at the level of cosmological process as an agent or power in the ongoing evolution of what Whitehead refers to as the vibrational continuum of our universe. On this picture, long before coming to serve as any kind of prosthesis for augmenting human interaction with the world, media will have already impacted the sensible conditions of experience as such, what I call worldly sensibility, in complex and myriad ways that indirectly inform emergent experiences at all levels of operationality, and specifically across the human-non-human divide. With its focus on this core question, can and how can humans be said to experience 21st century media, my discussion in Feed Forward largely centered around the task of restoring some mode of experiential contact between the perceptual and cognitive worlds of humans and the operationality of worldly sensibility. Guided by this focus, I look to the massive amount of data generated by today's computational sensing agents in order to discover a substitute or surrogate source of perceptual data about experience, including our own human experience. What computational sensing introduces is not simply an augmentation of human perception following the well-worn prosthetic model of media inaugurated by Plato, but rather a vastly expanded source of generalized perceptual data, including environmental data, that by taking the place of human sense perception, effectively stands in for a consciousness no longer up to the task of registering data of sensibility, including data of its own constitutive sensibility in real time. With this, the dream of phenomenology, at least in its classical formation, the dream that consciousness could coincide with its own constitution, seems definitively to have run its course. Section 2, a radicalized paradox of intersense, ? In the place of a constituting consciousness on the order of Husserl's time consciousness, today's media culture thus seemed to me to call for something like a radicalized version of Kant's paradox of inner sense, right? And you remember Kant says that inner sense, which is the sense we have of ourselves as selves perduring in time, is an operation, it's a second order operation that takes external representations, representations of processes happening in the world that are spatial representations, and orders them in a certain temporal order, and that gives the content of internal sense, the content of selfhood or subjectivity, right? And the argument that Kant makes is that we don't have any, otherwise we would have no content, right, for our internal sense, right? So literally, our sense of ourself for Kant is a representation of an ordering of experience that happens in the outside world, right? So a sort of second order process. Okay, so I'm saying that what I came to at the end of Feed Forward was something like a radicalization of this notion of inner sense, in the sense that when data is fed forward into consciousness about its own constitutive sensibility, consciousness lives its own sensibility, what I term the operational present of its sensibility, as representation, and indeed as second order reordering of external or outer representations that, as against Kant's account, are not its own first order products, but are furnished to it by computational sense, right? So we're not present at the moment of sensibility that is constitutive of us as consciousnesses. Sensors, data gathering processes gather data about this. We confront this data in a future moment in relation to the moment that it happens in consciousness, and we take it as a representation, right? So, but it's a representation that's not a reordering of representations we ourselves produce, but a reordering of representations produced by computational processes. Okay? What ensues, among other consequences, is an indissoluble temporal alienation of consciousness from the present of its own constituting sensibility, forever enjoined to live its own constituting sensibility as representation. Consciousness necessarily experiences its own present after the fact, which is to say, only once data about its sensible present has been fed forward into it. Reflecting on this now, I am struck by the way this supposed solution does nothing, in fact, to transform the terms in which the problem of what I called supervisory consciousness is posed. Consciousness, I claimed, is able to supervise its own heteroconstitution by designing situations for its own future emergence, right? So we can't coincide with the moment of our emergence, right, of our sensibility, but we can design for experiences that will lead to certain outcomes, right, according to a kind of design logic, right? So the idea of consciousness is supervisory, not as constitutive, right, which is what the phenomenologists from Husserl on down term it. Notwithstanding my animating interest in accounting for the technical distribution of consciousness, my exploration of consciousness's status after the end of the phenomenological dream approached the topics of media and consciousness as if they were separate and distinct aspects of the operationality of worldly sensibility. As a result, my characterization of 21st century consciousness as supervisory was restricted to the changed scope of consciousness. No longer able to coincide with its own constitution, consciousness could only experience its own constituting sensibility through representations, and indeed through technically produced representations, data about such sensibility that can be fed forward to it after the fact. Throughout this shift, consciousness itself does not change at all from the standpoint of its form and function. Consciousness remains set off against a world, or perhaps more accurately, against a material domain encompassing its own sensibility, to which it gains cognitive and perceptual access via the mode of representation. So this is myself criticizing myself, right? Put another way, because my focus was on exploring 21st century media's role in revealing the texture of worldly sensibility and on the feed-forward structure of consciousness this introduces, I was able to sidestep any sustained reckoning with the manner in which consciousness is itself necessarily transformed by the ontomaterial and epistemological mutations wrought by media. Okay, and so describing the transformation of consciousness is now my project, right, or the project that I'm engaged in this larger book project called Designing Consciousness. Section 3, Algorithmic Identity. The scope of consciousness is also put into question by recent developments in the area of what critics have begun to refer to as algorithmic identity. Algorithmic identity refers to the socio-technical processes through which categories of identity such as gender or income status can be defined via inference from data. John Cheney-Lippold describes the situation lucidly. The networked infrastructure of the internet, with its technological capacity to track user movements across different websites and servers, has given rise to an industry of web analytics firms that are actively amassing information on individuals and fine-tuning computer algorithms to make sense of that data. The product of many of these firms is a new algorithmic identity, an identity formation that works through mathematical algorithms to infer categories of identity on otherwise anonymous beings. It uses statistical commonality models to determine one's gender, class, or race in an automatic manner, at the same time as it defines the actual meaning of gender, class, or race themselves. Ultimately, it moves the practice of identification into an entirely digital and thus measurable plane. In his enumeration and explication of the qualities of algorithmic identity, Cheney-Lippold stresses the total break between algorithmic categories of identity and the lived experience of identity. Far from expressing a feature of the living individual as a whole, algorithmic categories submit the individual to a reorganization that obeys the algorithmic logic of data set and the protocols for searching and processing data. The identity of the individual is thereby filtered through an algorithmic selection process that extracts relevant behavioral data of individuals, which it assesses in relation to an aggregate of data mined from the behavior of populations of individuals. What is relevant is not any individual behavior in itself, but rather the relation of individual behavior to the larger aggregate. Understood as a new infrastructure for life itself, or what Cheney-Lippold dubs a soft biopolitics, algorithmic identification processes are characterized by the following traits. First, to the extent that everyone who uses the internet or a cell phone unavoidably generates traces of behavioral decisions, no one can escape subjection to algorithmic identification. So it's ubiquitous. Second, algorithmic identification categories are imposed on individuals rather than being self-selected by them. Third, algorithmic identification is partial in the sense that it selects features in virtue of categories it introduces. Moreover, it is effective precisely because it is partial in this sense. Fourth, algorithmic identification is statistical and probabilistic in nature, meaning it designates a degree of likelihood of an individual belonging to a category rather than a solid and certain identification. Fifth, algorithmic identification processes are incremental, since algorithms are made and remade in every instance of their use. The end result of the shift to algorithmic infrastructure is a wholesale transformation in the nature and operation of identity itself, one in which, as we shall see, individual and category enter into a bidirectional coevolution with one another. Instead of being the expression of an underlying entity or substance, that is, an individual, identity is a function of an algorithmic system of classification to which the individual is subordinated. Cheney-Lippold captures this perfectly when he writes, and I quote, "The implicit disorder of data collected about an individual is organized, defined, and made valuable by algorithmically assigning meaning to user behavior, and in turn, limiting the potential excess of meanings that raw data offer. By using these individual fragments, a subject's identity can be articulated according to the programmed rationale of the algorithm. It is thus not simply that the individual is subordinated to the algorithm. The individual is divided or dividuated, to invoke a particularly well-worn, if still incisive, Deleuzian concept, and recombined, but only partially and only instrumentally, as a function of a larger system in which it is implicated, but over which it has no control or mastery whatsoever. As an identification system or a soft biopolitical regime of control, algorithmic identity does not simply, and I quote Cheney-Lippold again, de-essentialize a category like gender from its corporeal and societal forms and determinations in order to re-essentialize gender as a statistically related, largely market research-driven category. And gender is the example from the database he's using in the article. So it does that, but it doesn't only do that. Far more impactfully, I want to suggest, it transforms identification from a process performed by an individual, a self-relation typically mediated by consciousness, into an algorithmic procedure executed by a computational network. The end result is not simply the individual's loss of control over its own identity, but a wholesale relocalization of the identification within socio-technical processes that bypass the purview of consciousness as such. Right, so we come to the same conclusion that I came to in my study of media. Algorithmic control, Cheney-Lippold concludes, works at levels far past the purview of liberal individualism, situating subjects within networks of power that govern indirectly and without proximity. The individual user is incapable of really experiencing the effect that algorithms have in determining one's life, as algorithms rarely, if ever, speak to the individual. Rather, individuals are seen by algorithm and surveillance networks as members of categories. So instead of positioning the individual as the locus of research, the addition of the level of the category can enable us to better understand the structuring of our lives under surveillance, as well as the myriad ways control can work on both individuals and categories. And it is here that the potential for discourse around identity becomes problematic. The identifications that make us subjects online are becoming more opaque and varied, away from our individual vantage points and removed from most forms of critical participation. They are increasingly finding mediation outside the realm of traditional political intervention and inside the black boxes of search engines and algorithmic inference systems. Section 4, curating consciousness. For many critics of media culture, this bleak depiction, or at least what I take to be a fairly bleak depiction, would simply serve to corroborate trends that have recently found inroads in the critical humanities, following speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, today's new materialisms, and the various modes of thought arising from the figure in the wake of the figure of the Anthropocene. Isn't the dethroning of consciousness at issue in contemporary media culture generally, and in the issue of algorithmic identity in particular, yet another reminder of the inescapable poverty of the human, one more lesson in how human modes of operation are increasingly sidelined in the face of a world that worlds, to cite Heidegger's poetic and to my mind newly felicitous term, with little, if any, regard whatsoever for human interests and life. When I recently taught Cheney-Lippold's essay to a group of computer science savvy, culturally curious undergraduate students, this was not at all the reaction I encountered. For these young people who lived the disjunction between the experience of selfhood and algorithmic individuation as a daily reality, the bypassing of consciousness was not so much a philosophical issue as a practical problem. For them, the crucial task was how to manage their online identities, a task which required them not just to curate media personas for a host of platforms in an echo of the instrumental partiality of algorithmic governance, but also, and to my mind more strikingly, to negotiate what impact the reality of individual individuation has on their relationship to themselves, on their experience precisely as individuals. This personal experience brought home to me just how limited my own approach to the issue of consciousness and its relation to media has been, as I mentioned at the outset of my talk today. While I had developed a non-prosthetic approach to media that relocated media's operationality in a far larger scope and at finer levels of temporal and material granularity than have humanist media critics from Plato to McLuhan, and importantly for me, to Bernard Stiegler, I restricted the significance of this reframing of media to the way it expands our cognitive access to sensibility, facilitating a technical process of presentification in the place of sense perception, and introducing a mechanism for feeding forward data concerning the imperceptible present of our sensibility into a subsequent moment of consciousness. Throughout all of this, and despite its dethroning from its philosophical pride of place, consciousness, again, as I've already mentioned, continued to function as it always had, namely as a privileged mode of human agency, not to mention a source of human privilege, that performs a self-reflection on a subjective interiority set off against the outside world as such. Shocked into thought by my students' reception of the problem of algorithmic identity, I began to understand that consciousness was not, or at least was no longer, the pure and hallowed philosophical figure of the subject that I, following mentors like Stiegler, and before him Husserl and even Whitehead, took it to be. Indeed, while I sought to emulate Whitehead's procedure for today's media-centric world, attempting to embed or re-embed consciousness in the full environmental context from which it arises, thus correcting for its, quote, own initial excess of subjectivity, I had failed, I felt, to grapple with the reality that consciousness no longer functions primarily as a report on subjective interiority, but rather operates as a component of a larger worldly situation, or better, of a process of individuation that encompasses it and in which it is implicated. In the case of my students' experience of identity, this individuation process includes, without distinctly separating, their experience as algorithmic individuals, their attempts to negotiate such experience with their broader identities, and the operational impact that such negotiation has on their sense of self or existence as individuals. Section 5, individuation. My students' consciousnesses, I realized, were not consciousnesses about this situation. Sorry, you know what, I have it in the singular. Their consciousness, my students' consciousness, I realized, is not a consciousness about this situation, but is itself an accomplishment of the situation, something brought about by the situation writ large, in which it is itself implicated. The experience of selfhood, of being an individual, is not therefore an experience set off against an outside that it could take as its intentional correlate, following Husserl and Stiegler. Rather, it is itself a part of a larger outside, of a situation that includes consciousness, not as a self-reflective fold, as a power of subjective interiority, but instead, and more radically, as a power of the situation itself. Put another way, consciousness is not composed of subjective contents that belong to it and that constitute so many intentional correlates, so many aboutnesses of its noetic activity. Consciousness is not about something, not about anything at all. It is something. And what it is a dimension of the larger environmental situation in which it is implicated and which brings it about as such. It is, of course, Deleuze who made this distinction between aboutness and being about something or being something. And it is in reference to Bergson that he did so in the Cinema Volume Number 1. However, it is another philosopher, Gilbert Simondon, whose account of individuation can help us theorize the transformation of consciousness that is at stake in contemporary media culture and its constitutive processes of algorithmic governance or soft biopolitics. For Simondon, that is, consciousness is not a capacity or accomplishment of a completed or fully individuated individual, as it is for Western philosophers, up to and including both Heidegger and Whitehead. On the contrary, it is a feature or aspect of a larger environmental situation, what Simondon calls a process of individuation, and as such is an accomplishment of and names a power of the situation and not of the subject. If the human retains a privilege for Simondon, it is on radically different grounds than Heidegger's self-questioning Dasein or Whitehead's ennobling of consciousness as the pinnacle of cosmological process. For Simondon, that is, human consciousness is privileged because, as a part of any larger environmental process implicating humans, it is the vehicle for knowledge of the world as such. In the final lines to the introduction of his magnum opus on individuation, Simondon writes, "The individuation of reality exterior to the subject is grasped by the subject due to an individuation that is analogous to knowledge in the subject. But it is by means of the individuation of knowledge and not knowledge alone that the individuation of non-subject beings is grasped. Such beings can be known by the knowledge of the subject, but the individuation of these beings can only be grasped by the individuation of the knowledge of the subject. Knowledge of individuation can only come through the individuation of knowledge. What this means is that knowledge and the consciousness that is its vehicle is produced in the very process of individuation within which it becomes individuated." And for Simondon, the individual is never fully individuated, always engaged in an ongoing process of individuation that involves both a relationship to a milieu, a selection of the environment that is coupled to it, and in relation to what he calls the pre-individual, which is the rest of stuff that remains unactualized in most cases, but available as potential for future developments of the individual, right? And thus assures the openness of the individual. So section 6, which is called environmentality. This understanding of consciousness as a surveying of the entire individuation within which it arises can help us appreciate what is, from a philosophical standpoint, interesting and productive about algorithmic identity. Notwithstanding the concrete reductions to which it submits the whole being of any individual, processes of algorithmic identity construction give agency to environmental factors that would, on the traditional philosophical account, remain outside the purview of consciousness. Algorithmic identity processes draw on the entire constantly evolving network of correlations associated with instances of behavior, data sets about instances of behavior, aggregates of behavior, and indeed, the fact that algorithmic categories themselves fluctuate as data continues to be gathered demonstrates perfectly the fluid boundary or non-boundary between system and individual. Far from being entities in their own right, algorithmic individuals are constructions forged from environmental data. For Cheney-Lippold, such, quote, cybernetic categorization instances a post-disciplinary notion of power. Users are not categorized according to one-off census survey data, but through a process of continual interaction with and modification of the categories through which biopolitics works. Accordingly, soft biopolitics can govern subjects at a distance, guarding their apparent autonomy while optimizing systems of difference in which the field is left open to fluctuating processes. In such instances, as Foucault observes in his biopolitics lectures, quote, "There is an environmental type of intervention instead of the internal subjugation of individuals. Control is not exercised directly on an already fully formed or fully individuated individual, but rather indirectly on the larger field in relation to which the individual is constantly in the process of being individuated." Right? So the positive side of algorithmic identification for me is the way in which it brings into play in a very strong way the environmental surround of an individual, right? Of an individual in the process of individuation, right? Thus proposing the beginning of a different understanding of what individuals are, individuation is, and consciousness of that individuation is. For Tarleton Gillespie, the environmental openness of algorithmic categorization is inseparable from the impenetrability that, as we observed above, seems to work at cross purposes to traditional notions of conscious human subjects. There may be, he observes, something in the end impenetrable about algorithms. They are designed to work without human intervention. They are deliberately obfuscated, and they work with information on a scale that is hard to comprehend, at least without other algorithmic tools. Yet this very impenetrability, which should be understood more as an impenetrability of the environment itself, and not simply of the algorithm's implementation, right? So an impenetrability that's due to the massive and diffuse amounts of data that are being gathered, right, in the process of constructing these identity categories, but in the process also of creating individuals, right? So the impenetrability, which should be understood more as an impenetrability of the environment itself, and not just of the algorithm's implementation, can become an asset in the sense that it opens consciousness to material elements informing its individuation in ways that cannot be grasped as its own proper contents, right? So it has the potential to put us into contact with material aspects of our own identity as individuals, or our own process of individuation that we would not be able to encounter through consciousness. And I continue to quote Gillespie. So in many ways, algorithms remain outside our grasp, and they are designed to be. That is not to say that we should not aspire to eliminate their working and their impacts. We should, but we may also need to prepare ourselves for more and more encounters with the unexpected and ineffable associations they will sometimes draw for us, and the palpable but opaque undercurrents that move quietly beneath knowledge when it is managed by algorithms. So section 7, the final section. Intersense, further radicalized. Now it is just this sort of situation that I had in mind in Feed Forward when I positioned 21st century media in the position of perceptual surrogate for consciousness. If human consciousnesses are never present to the operationality of their own constituting sensibility, data about that sensibility can supplement this absence, providing us with information after the fact about our own genesis. This scenario is both made more concrete and also inflected in a particular manner by the example of algorithmic identity. For it is the case, as shown by the example of my students negotiating the role of their individuations, it is the case that we can gain information about ourselves from studying the data that informs our algorithmic identity. And it is the case as well that such self-study, such self-relation as research, always comes after the fact and helps us not to contest that identification itself, but to curate or design for future identifications. What also becomes clear from the concrete example of algorithmic identification is that the data that supplements the impoverished scope of consciousness is not a supplementation of consciousness itself. These data are not substitute contents of consciousness, but rather they are data about a sensibility, the larger environment in which consciousness is and continues to be individuated that cannot take the form of contents of consciousness. Such a situation requires a more radical radicalization of the paradox of intersense than I had envisioned and that I sketched out above. The outer representations that are provided to consciousness by algorithmic governance procedures are not data for the construction of a self-representation, but data that concern the larger environmental operation of the field in which consciousness is individuated. The material moment that Deleuze locates in the attenuation of the Kantian paradox of intersense, the realization that, and he borrows the term from the poet Rimbaud, je et un autre, I am another. So the realization that the material moment that Deleuze locates in the attenuation of the Kantian paradox of intersense, the realization that je et un autre must be expanded to encompass the material synthesis of environmentality itself, of the entire situation within which consciousness is being individuated. Instead, we must say, instead of je et un autre, we must say, je et un environnement. I am an environment, where the et, the is, has the force of Deleuze's rejection of intentionality in his comments on Bergson. I am an environment means that consciousness, or the conscious individual, is an accomplishment of an environmental process that includes as its materiality, not just Intersense's appropriation of environmental data as its manifold, but far more importantly, the entirety of the situation from which it emerges. What consciousness takes as its content in this case is doubly distanced from anything that can be considered its own or be positioned as internal to its operation. Not only are the representations, the data it lives, not produced by consciousness itself, but the second order operation it carries out to process such data does not yield a self-representation so much as a pure presentification. In this role, and considered in relation to its long-standing philosophical vocation, consciousness effectively empties itself out to lend itself to the larger socio-technical system. What it presentifies as its content is nothing more nor less than the result of system operations. In this sense, consciousness is an expression, not of a self or individual in isolation from the environment, which is the way it's been thought by all philosophers, I think, and by me in my book, even though I thought I was doing something different. So it is not that. It is not a sense of self or individual in isolation from the environment, but the vast and ever-changing, but rather an expression of the vast and ever-changing environment in which it is implicated and from which it arises. Thank you.
Any time for questions?
Yes, please.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I was trying to track, early on you talked about the making measurable, that algorithms sort of imply the making measurable of the world. What role does the indeterminate or the unmeasurable play in this?
I mean, I'm very interested in the production of the new and the production of the future, and really, I've gotten at it through Whitehead's idea of potentiality of the universe, right? Where he says the settled universe, the way it is, has a lingering superjectal power which belongs to each of its actual instances, each of its little components, to produce a future. Or another way he says it is that the future's already in the present, right? But there's a openness to that and non-measurability to that, right? That's crucial for that concept. So what I'm interested in is, I'm obviously not interested in some super algorithmic identification process that's going to do something other than what these kinds of consumer-driven procedures do, right? But what I'm interested in the concept is the way in which it enfranchises, it makes important the environmental dimension of individuation outside of consciousness. And I would suggest that that could not be measured, like the extent of that could not be measured, right? It can only be brought into play by models that capture it as it's happening, right? Something like that. So it's not a process of measuring, but it uses a procedure of measure in order to conceptualize the agency of the environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'd be happy to explain more stuff too, because I realize that it's, in some ways I'm like self-criticizing myself and getting deeper down the rabbit hole. And you know, if you haven't spent however long it takes to read my book and then however much longer it takes to read Whitehead or whatever, you know, it could be difficult. So I'd be happy to explain things that I said also, yes.
Just trying to kind of put pieces together. Thank you very much for this very enriching talk. So you seem to kind of approach, so you have this distinction between media, kind of the pre-21st century, post-21st century, one's environmental data-driven anticipation of the future. And you think this is the element that makes the newer media, so to say, environmental? Because you have this, you said, if media have become environmental, because other media ecologists, for instance, would say media have always been environmental.
Yeah, right.
But you would say no.
Well, no, I mean, I would agree with that. Like, so for example, I'm not making the claim that there's never been media like this before. And in fact, one person that I'm really very interested in is this guy, Etienne Jules Marais, who's one of the chronophotographers, who makes the argument that his measuring media, so be it the graphical machines he starts with or the chronophotographical machines, he makes the argument that these are not surrogates for human sensation and perception. They're not giving us a kind of extended function of our own vision and our own perception. They have sensory domains of their own, right? So they're sensors in their own right that have a different sensory world than the world that we have. And I want to argue that that kind of thing has become
generalized and ubiquitous in the age of like cheap sensors that are in the environment, phones that can track different kinds of things about what we do, and so on and so forth, right? And the question then about infrastructure of media and so on is super interesting as well, right? Because I think in a way the concept of media, you know, so I'm working with this idea of like film and, you know, media that is really geared to present human experience to humans, right, in a technical form, right? Versus, you know, media that is like in some ways infrastructural, right? That is behind the scenes, operating on the world in which we live, but not directly on our perception and our sensation, right? And I think that that the question of media is in question in a much bigger way than that today, right? With a lot of the work on infrastructure, and I think that yeah, I think that ultimately, because the book that I'm writing really is about Simondon. It's really about making an argument that Simondon is a philosopher of design, right? And by design, I mean the idea of designing a future environment that will solicit kinds of experiences based on like knowledge that we've gained about our experience, even though we're not present at our experience, at the moment of our experience. And part of that is making an argument about really a generalization of what media is, right? So that media becomes an actual relation, right? Rather than a technology or something like this. And I think it, you know, part of the impetus for that is responding to this, to these movements in media that are making it much more than just the things that we thought it's been for the last 20 years or something like this.
Actually, that leads into my next question, because I really like your approach with consciousness and how it's outside of, you know, the human, and, you know, you need to look at it more from an environmental perspective. That kind of brings to my mind concepts such as atmosphere, mood, to my mind, affect. That kind of all ties into that, and, you know, we're still kind of trying to bring it to terms with how do we measure it, how do we make it tangible and talk about it in academia. So it seems to be trying to get at that a little bit,
Yeah.
with that term.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, atmospheric is a word that I've used in Feed Forward to describe environmental media, or becoming environmental of media. And the affect thing actually in the Simondon has a specific role, because ultimately, and I haven't worked out this argument, but Simondon makes the claim that, I mean, essentially that the highest form of human existence is trans-individuation, right? Where we're individuated together with others in a single formation that isn't the accumulation of individuals in a group, right? Like an inter-individuation of sociology or traditional sociology, right? But it's a de-individuation of each individual as a psychic biological individuation, and specifically as a psychic individuation, and a re-individuation as part of this trans-individuation. And I want to make an argument about how media are, this is it, media are the relational the relational support or infrastructure for that kind of an operation. And part of that in Simondon, I mean, he says the experience of anxiety, he locates it very specifically in the psychic individual in isolation attempting to solve its own problems. And he says the individual comes to an impasse, right? And this is essentially, for reasons I'm not exactly sure, but it has to do with the fact that he thinks that we are trans-individuational beings, right? That's what we are as humans. So we try to solve our own problems, the problem of our psychic isolation and so on ourselves, and it leads to the problem of anxiety, right? And the problem of, sort of an affective situation we can't master. And that's the impetus then to de-individuate and re-individuate, right? And so what I'm trying to do really is rethink media as an operation that allows that to happen. I don't know if that still is sort of vague, but it's as far as I've gotten myself. Yes.
Could you I'm just wondering, what are the implications for critical thinking once we dislodge the individual from consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, I want to with, you know, one thing that Whitehead says is, you know, so Whitehead, I don't know how well anyone knows Whitehead, but Whitehead in Process and Reality and Related Works in his final period as a speculative metaphysician, you know, is attempting to reposition consciousness for him as the highest achievement of cosmological process, but it's also the one that has the most narrow bandwidth, right? So it selects out a lot of stuff in order to have the clarity and power that it has. And so what he's trying to do is put it back into the richer context from which it emerges. So he starts by making a distinction between sense perception and then another form of perception, which is what he calls perception in the mode of causal efficacy, right? Which includes the fact that I'm using these parts of my body, for example, my eyes, you know, whatever, to see, my ears to hear, right? And he says we become aware of this at moments when our eyes are tired or whatever, and we realize we're using this. And then it goes back beyond that to the environmental conditions of the moment, you know, ultimately everything that brings me up to this moment. So the entirety of my past in this world and so on. And obviously that's way outside of the scope of any analyst, right? No matter how good your data methods are, right? But, you know, the idea is that perception is the end point of this much larger process, right? That is part of the material world or part of the environmental world. So the task then is really not to throw out the human or to throw out consciousness or whatever, which some of the people that have been reading Whitehead along the lines of Deleuze have done, right? It's not to do that, but it's to rethink what consciousness can do. And that's really what I'm trying to do now, right? So consciousness can tell us a lot about how we're formed by this environmental agency, right? But only not as an introspection of itself or taking that representation of that agency as its content, right? But understanding itself as part of a larger process, right? And so that's exactly what I'm trying to describe here, right? So it's really an effort to redescribe, reposition, you know, in some ways in a more humble role, consciousness, right? So it's no longer, you know, like the mind coinciding with its own constitution the way Husserl thought it would be, right? But it's now consciousness trying to analyze all the stuff that's happened that made it be what it is, and then tweak it so that it can control how that happens moving forward.
I'm wondering.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you could give an example of that, because I'm thinking of, like, you know, Foucault trying to describe epistemes, for instance. Is that kind of what you're thinking? I mean, or what would be an equivalent in this context? Or Foucault trying, you know, because you're talking about environment, but Foucault also thinks about space, very important to the way he thinks about environment, whether it's the panopticon or the classroom or the factory or whatever. So those are different ways in which I think he tries to think about this issue of context. So how would that translate in this context? Or what's an example of that?
I mean, actually, it's a very interesting question, because I'm looking for I want an example that I can trace across a whole book. You know, like I want a big example, and I haven't found one. You know, I've been looking at certain kinds of technical procedure, but, you know, they're all too small. So I don't know. I don't have an example. If anyone does, please let me know. Yes.
Well, I was thinking, I mean, I don't know a lot of the work that you've referenced. I do know Jane Leapold's work a little bit in terms of algorithmic identity. And all I can think about, and this might be an example, but if you're talking about consumer data and what kind of consciousness is being developed, I mean, you could argue, I mean, it's like a marketing consciousness, you know, and is that really, you know, like if we're talking about algorithmic tools and data that's collected from our behaviors online or whatever, I mean, you know, that might be one way of thinking of, you know, of an example that you can trace. You know, and also, like, who owns these algorithms and who owns the data? That's going to tell, you know, like what kind of ownership regime within this environment.
Yeah, you know, I understand what you're saying, and I mean, on that, you know, I'm trying to like dance a fine dance here, where I'm first of all, I want to recognize that, like, and I do this already in Feed Forward, but I want to recognize that, like, these algorithms are powerful tools of control that are also private, you know, they're owned privately, and, you know, but then on the other hand, I want to take the model in which, like, I think that what they're getting at when they analyze behavior actually has some power to it, right? As a way of describing, like, as an alternate description for why people do things, for example, right? To like asking them, I mean, the older model is asking people why they do things. Why'd you buy this? Why'd you do this? So you listen to somebody who's processing their decisions through their own understanding of themselves consciously, right? So you have this new model, which is, let's look at their behavior. Let's take little tiny snippets of behavioral data and compare it with other people, right, in these aggregates, and then it'll come to have meaning. So it's a very powerful tool for describing how agency happens, or what agency is, or what identity is, or what individuals are.
But
right?
of a very particular.
Right, and that's the problem. So I want to use it. I want to use it for the power of the model in opening up to that environmental stuff. But I certainly don't want to, champion like a consumer consciousness, right? In fact, it would be the opposite. Like we could learn that this is how it constructs us, and that there are ways to fight against that, or something like that, right? So the question is finding examples. I mean, so I do it like I was talking to Ezekiel about my lab at Duke, where we make it's the speculative sensation lab, and we design sensor networks using Arduino, stuff and sensors and so on. And it's always in the interest of, reclaiming. Like we did one project where we had one of our members let us gather data from her web searches for like a week. And we took all the data that was being generated that didn't appear in the screen, or that didn't appear to her, and we turned it into the basis for a 3D model, and then we printed it, right? And the idea was, this is like a sculpture of this thing that companies gather about us that's outside of our purview, and so on. So there's a way in which you have these, they're kind of like parodic utopian projects of reclaiming, the data and whatever, but they're only demonstrations, of how it really works, or something like that, right? I mean, the agency is really in the power of these companies that do this, right? So the question is, can we, how do we get outside that model? For me, I mean, is the question, and I don't really know. I haven't, so I'm aware of the issue, and I don't know exactly how to deal with that.
I mean, I was just gonna sort of piggyback and ask the question. I mean, we talked about this earlier, would the Dylan Roof and Google search example be an example of this? And I don't know if you're all familiar with this, but Dylan Roof, the gunman in South Carolina, who committed all the killings in the church in Charleston, South Carolina, in his own account talks about how he became ideologically radicalized from his engagement with the Google and doing searches on black on white violence or black on white crime, and how it brought him to all these white supremacist websites. And literally,
so it's a sort of filter bubble that kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Yeah. I mean, it certainly would be an example of how these algorithmic processes work, right? But also it would be an example, like I'm interested in, there are two steps at least there, right? One is the idea of correlations of behavioral traits that lead you, that determine what one piece of information is going to lead to the next, and so on, right? And that's that is an open-ended model. But then when it starts spiraling into ever smaller filter bubbles, right? That's a product of algorithms that are making decisions about how that environmental agency should be used, and it's always used reductively, right? So the question is, could we design, things that didn't do that? Right, that used algorithms in a way that opened out instead of closed down, or something like that. I mean, that's the question, I think, right? Yes.
So hearing you talk, I have a question about how you deal with Marxist thought in your own work, because your description made me think that you find this process to be a sort of ambiguous change, that it helps us understand conceptually in a valuable way this new notion of identity, but that there are these private forces that are not great. So, but what I hear you describing seems to me very similar to interpolation, right? Aren't you just being interpolated by an algorithm? And rather than having like a police officer say, hey, you guy, you have like your daily me customized to you. So yeah, I hate having comments disguised as a question, but I guess that sort of was. But my question the question is, do you see any relationship with that kind of process? And is it maybe more sinister because you don't have it's more covert?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's more sinister because it's more covert, right? I mean, I think algorithms, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. Algorithms select for all kinds of things, but most people have little literacy in how that works, right? So even when they do web searches. They don't understand that like Google has logged all of their previous web searches. It's, you know, comparing what they're doing to all these other people in order to determine what they get, right? I mean, and so gaining awareness of how that works is an important political self-education. But I do think it's sinister, right? In some ways, it's more sinister than that canonical picture of interpolation, because at least you're aware that power is being exercised on you, right?
And it's visible. It's not black spots.
Right, exactly. Right. What I like about the, you know, what I like about the idea of the algorithm opening to this environmental outside is exactly that it can present us with data about our own behavior that we would never get to any other way, right? And in a way, you're right. Those two things, they go together, but in a really uncomfortable way, right? And you can't. I mean, in some ways, the problem that I'm having is that you can't just do the one without the other. And in fact, the sinister effects, the forms of control that are exercised here are far more prominent than anything positive, right? You know, which is why I talk about my students doing this, because for me, like, I just won't, like, I shut this stuff off, right? But I'm like old enough that I can get by with that or whatever. I don't know. You know, I mean, I probably not, right? It's happening to everybody. But yes.
So just as a suggestion, you might consider, given the contemporary moment, something around the previous, the political election and the way in which political consciousness became shaped as a result. There might be some, big examples there. But actually, my question actually is related to, you mentioned new materialisms earlier. And I was actually really thinking about the notion of consciousness as really being in the environment. And even I love the quote, I am an environment. And I started to think about Barad and the ways in which Barad takes up agency as relational ontologies. And so agency is not within the subject at all. It's very much so about interactive material reconfigurings. So very distributive agency. And it sounds like there's some similarities, but I wonder if I'm missing a nuance here, especially given that I know that Barad and Deleuze, their ontologies are not necessarily the same. So I'm wondering if there's some nuances there that I might be missing, where you might be departing with Barad.
I mean, I don't, I read the book a while ago, and I do have a small discussion of what she says about Bohr in relation to quantum measurement, right? Because she sees Bohr as a humanist, and I don't see Bohr as a humanist. I see him as a kind of, somebody who radicalizes the Bachelardian notion of phenomenotechnic, right? And so there's no noumenon behind the phenomenon, right? And so on. But I think the interaction is her term, right? I mean, I think that sounds like, I haven't looked at that in a while, but it sounds something very similar to, the way that I'm trying to describe, like she's trying to describe agency in a similar way to the way I'm trying to describe consciousness, as something that belongs to and comes out of a much larger process, right? And is only, if it's separated out, it's only separated out like at the end, and in the best of cases for strategic purposes of trying to understand something about how that process works. I mean, another person who thinks like this is William James, right? When he says, thinking happens all the time, and occasionally there's a thinker, right? And Whitehead's idea of the superject is also a notion like this, right? Where there's agency in the things that compose me, right, or that compose my consciousness, right? And it's not my consciousness.
This is an emergent thinker, not necessarily emerges out of the continuum of, got it.
Yes. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you see a place for small data.
Small data.
Yeah, in this analysis,
And tell me what you're thinking.
or ethnography.
Okay, like more qualitative kind of data.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking of the way in which so much of the emphasis on the algorithm or the API overlooks, the ways in which people interact with those, maybe, or refuse.
Well, in some ways, that's what I learned from my students. Is that like they were like, sure, we are aware that when we go on, that when we go on these social media sites, that like the currency is to like things, right? And so you have to be in a good mood all the time. You only go when you're in a good mood or whatever, right? It's not like they're savvy. They understand how these things work, right? And so they're using them strategically you know, for certain things. Now, I think there's also a way in which they don't have a choice about it, right? If that's how they communicate with their friends, or if everybody's doing it, then there's a kind of compulsion to do it. They're compelled to do it, right? But nonetheless, they're still using it in a way that isn't fully subordinating themselves to the logic, the algorithmic logic of the platform, right? And I think that that's important.
Right. Well, even, I mean, think of like Facebook, you know, I mean, like the way you filter who you want to follow on Facebook.
Right. Right.
You know, I tend to follow a lot of anthropologists.
Right.
You know, because,
Right.
you know, and so, you know, sure, you know, maybe you're participating in the like, don't like, or whatever. Now they have different options you can choose, but still you have the ability to filter your feed.
Right.
And to be a part of maybe a different type of a collective consciousness that you choose to shape in some ways, and that also shapes your own agency.
Yeah, definitely.
So.
Yeah, and they're very much thinking in terms of like curating identities on these platforms and stuff like this. You know, in virtue of things that are important to them independently of who they are on those platforms, or who they're, you know, that kind of thing. So I do think that's important.
Just because they're curating identities, I'm also curating my own identity. You know, I mean, you could say maybe the fact that you're participating in Facebook means that you're already, you know, compromised or whatever. But I'm not so sure if that's completely the case.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yes.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about your term non-prosthetic theory of media, because if media are man-made artifacts, or maybe possibly animal-made artifacts, then how can they be non-prosthetic?
So I mean that exactly in the sense that Murray means when he says my machines have sensory worlds of their own, right? So they're not prostheses for human organs or human capacities, right? They actually have an autonomous sensory relationship to a world, right? And their sensory world is to some extent impenetrable to us as humans, right? And so they're not prostheses, they're different worlds or something like that we can actually then get access to through those technologies, but they're not prostheses for our own, like it's not our own perception that's doing that, right? It's their perception, right? I mean, that's what I mean by that. Does that make sense?
So it's referring to the
it's referring to the operation of replacement of, you know, I mean, so in this dialogue that the Phaedrus, you know, begins with the idea of writing, and so writing's bad because it's going to ruin our memories, but it's good because it gives us back an artificial form of memory, right? So it's a prosthetic form of memory, you know, and that goes down through McLuhan, you know, and so on, Stiegler. So that's what I'm saying is too limiting, right? It's too limiting because it constrains the operation of techniques to human capacities, right? And in a way, I got to this by really, I don't know how well you know, or if you know Bernard Stiegler's work, right? But I mean, he's got this way in which he's supplementing Husserl's model of memory, so primary retention, secondary retention, and so on. And everything's about contents of consciousness. So films and technical media offer us artificial or technical contents of consciousness that take the place of inherited experience, right? And so this is why in this kind of Frankfurt School argument he makes, culture's gone to hell, right? And for me, and then at the same time, in the general introduction to the second volume of his book, Technics in Time, or his project Technics in Time, he describes the way in which digital media works and computational media works at a totally different level than anything that could take the form of a content of consciousness, right? So it's really that disjunction in his own work that kind of I followed along to get to this point of making the argument that we need to think about non-prosthetic forms of media in order to give full due to what the technical procedures can do, right? That's where that's from, yes.
When you're talking about Murray and the perceptual worlds of media technologies, it kind of got me thinking that this is actually, like, a lot of this stuff is actually a temporal relationship that is not beyond the human, I guess, rather than necessarily spatial. And I think there's something, I don't know, maybe you can speak more about that, because that kind of just occurred to me.
We'll say more about what you mean by a temporal relationship.
Well, I'm thinking of the horse, you know, jumping, and you see that it's, in fact, there's a point where it has, you know, haul hooves off the ground, which is not something that's apparent when you're just watching a horse run, or these kinds of things that you're able to detect.
Right. And if you put that in contemporary context, you have these marketers who are looking at like brain scans, or they're looking at microtemporal processes that are far faster than anything we could have attention on, right? Yeah.
Or I was gonna jump in terms of trying to like explain, like how machines perceive things differently than humans. Scanning or tunneling electron microscopes, you have to have algorithms in order to perceive what these machines are.
Right.
Because they're actually, and it also kind of fulfills a temporal.
Right.
Because electrons.
Because it's happening in a time frame that we don't share, and so we need a mediation in order to be able to participate in what they're doing. But that participation doesn't make it our experience; it's still their experience that we're gaining access to, or something like that, right?
Yeah, something.
Yeah, that's what I would say that. Yeah, sure. I mean, I spent a lot of time like getting down the Husserlian rabbit hole of the time consciousness stuff, right? Because Husserl, he has this model of constituting consciousness, and he deepens it then already in the original lectures, and then in these manuscript notes that he did in a couple of times during his career, really gets to the point of having to say, like, consciousness is not constitutive. It belongs to a worldly time. Retention and protension are made possible by depresencing of the world and so on. And, so it's really, he's saying time is a human thing and world time is a human thing. And he ends up realizing that's wrong, but he can't take that step because it would just be abandoning his entire philosophical project. But that's really right. There's a worldly time that's much more complex and much greater than human time, and human time belongs to it, right? But then, I think what's important about technical processes is that they actually allow us to address dimensions of that world time in ways that are become really hard to ignore, right? And become really productive for understanding that, right? I mean, it's always been the case. If you think about the time of a tree or something, it's different than ours, but I mean, it doesn't do anything. So, but if you think about these kinds of examples, right, where you have technical processes that are actually doing things that we can't participate in, then you have to ask yourself, what does that mean, right?
So earlier you had mentioned Simon Doan, and for Simon Doan, and correct me if I'm wrong, consciousness is not capacity. And I mean, you went further to talk about what Simon Doan's perspective and conceptualization of consciousness is. But I actually want to stop on that point. Consciousness is not a capacity. And I asked the question, how does Simon Doan conceptualize capacity? And I'm thinking about this especially with respect to algorithmic thinking, algorithmic processes, and in the sense of the very software thinking as a capacity that might be understood as a capacity in and of itself. So how might Simon Doan understand and think and conceptualize capacity?
Did I say that consciousness is not a capacity?
And maybe I misheard that.
I might have. I mean, for him, consciousness is an accomplishment of a larger environmental situation, not a, what did I say? Not a, yeah, maybe I said capacity, right? I mean, it's not a capacity, like, it's not a capacity of the human as this thing that's set off against the world or something like that, right? I mean, which is the traditional picture of it, right? And it's also the traditional picture of sense perception, right? We take in information through our senses, then we organize it in a certain way and create perceptions, right? That's also not the case, right? So, I mean, it's hard. It's really hard, and then James is another person who describes this really well, but it's hard to, it's so ingrained in us to think in terms of the subject-object distinction, to think in terms of the human is doing all this processing and so on. And, in some ways, I think it's also why it was so easy for people like Graham Harman or whatever to just say, forget like, or Mayasu, right, to make this argument or correlation. I mean, the more difficult thing is to rethink the human, right, in light of this new picture of this environmental situation. I mean, it's not a new environmental, the revelation of the environmental situation that we have today through the media that we're dealing with. So Simon Doan is particularly interesting because he really doesn't give a crap about consciousness as a philosophical problem and self-consciousness and stuff like that. So for him, consciousness really becomes a modality of, it's a modality of every individuation that is also privileged in a certain sense because it's the way in which we can understand the individuation of things that are not like us, right? So, I mean, he would give an explanation of how we understand the scan and tunnel and microscope in terms of
the individuation of the knowledge that happens at the same time as the individuation of the process itself, right? So it's a kind of, so humans are in a certain way, humans and animals that can have consciousness, right, are in a certain way, and maybe machines that can do it too. I mean, I would think that he would think machines could do it too, are in a certain way vehicles for the revelation of the world or something like that for him, right? That's it.
Yeah.
So it's a completely different understanding. And I've been working on this project for a while, and it's still hard to get my mind around, like when he says perception is not the processing of information in here, it's part of the situation, I mean, it's that arises at the, it's hard to really, I try to slow down and stop thinking about it in his terminology, whatever, and just say, what is happening in that moment? What is happening in that process? And it's really hard to describe that. Masumi has his technique of using, I mean, in a way, I think it's not the direction I want to go, or it's not the way I want to do it, because it makes it more complex rather than less complex. But he does go with it, right, and really try to dwell in that process, which I appreciate.
I mean, in a way in which Masumi leans on Spinoza in particular to think about capacity and as conceptualizing as that which is able to be affected or be affected.
Right. All right, good.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for your time.